something relatively similar to this before. The bottom one is the Secure Development Lifecycle as defined by Microsoft. As you can see, it has the same steps basically to it. The main difference is that each of these phases becomes retooled to focus on security. So instead of just worrying about what requirements are necessary for a customer, you have to worry about, let's talk about the security requirements. Are there any compliance issues that come into play here? When you get to the verification phase, you don't just worry about making sure that the functionality is working as expected. You also make sure that the security features are expected and that you can't access the application in a way you shouldn't be able to. The idea behind this really is that bugs are cheaper to fix the earlier you find them. This is a pretty well-known truth in software development. It's especially true of security bugs. Vulnerabilities become exponentially more expensive as they make their way out the door because of the reputational damage done to companies, because of the speed with which patching needs done, because of the data that could be exposed. So this system helps to alleviate some of that cost. Phase 3 is the design phase. This is where things like you create your specification for your project, you worry about your attack surface, how big it is currently, how big it's going to be for the project, and also where you create your threat model. A lot of people say that this is one of the most important, if not the most important step in the Microsoft SDL. And it's really great to do it during the design phase because this is before any code has been written at all. This is the conceptual phase. Nothing's been done yet. So if we can identify flaws, we can identify vulnerabilities, we can identify some business logic problems here, then they can all be fixed before we have to worry about fixing them in the code because, again, no code has been written yet. So here's the definition of threat modeling. Threat modeling is a process to understand security threats to a system, determine risks from those threats, and establish the appropriate mitigation. The best part about threat modeling really is that threat modeling itself is really easy to learn, and you don't actually need any sort of security expertise to really make your way through most of it. It's a great way to actually learn security along the way because you can get people of varying understanding levels into the room on the threat model, and you can start to pick up patterns, and eventually you can gain more security knowledge that way. Threat modeling is done in several phases, and we're going to go over them all here. So, assuming you have separate dev and QA teams, you want to involve everybody in these threat modeling processes. It's much more effective as a collaborative effort. As you saw earlier, we have these implementation and verification phases in the Microsoft SDO. These phases become infinitely more effective after threat modeling has been completed. After you have a prominent threat model, developers know exactly what they're supposed to be developing, what threats they're supposed to be protecting against, and how they're supposed to be mitigating those threats. Whereas your QA staff will have a better idea of the tests they should be running against these things. You've identified some weakness areas. They know to attack those weakness areas to make sure that they've been fixed. They can get all kinds of test cases, and there's a ton of information that your QA staff can glean from being part of a threat modeling meeting. It's important to find a middle ground when getting involved in threat modeling. When you first start out, it's very easy to either start out too high up and miss a lot of important features and maybe miss some vulnerabilities that you would have otherwise caught. And it's also easy to get too far into the weeds and start getting out of scope or dealing with too technical features that you really end up wasting time. Sometimes you can see experienced people that are experienced at making threat models can knock these out in half an hour. Teams that are not experienced can take up to 4 and 5 hours, I've seen. So it all depends on finding this balance and getting that experience. So here's a pretty basic threat model. As you can see, if you've never seen one of these before, it's a little overwhelming, a little confusing to see what's going on. But when we really walk through it, it's not that complicated. We have a user here who's sending commands to an application service. The application service is sending the requests to the database and getting the results and sending them back to the user. There's also a login process and some settings stored in a registry. These are all shown by various elements, and we'll walk through those in just a minute here. This is what's known as a data flow diagram. By adding trust boundaries, which is this red dotted line, and by identifying threats along the path, that's what makes it a threat model. And like I said, it might be a little intimidating at first, but it definitely gets easier with experience, like anything else. You learn to read it, you learn to sight read, you recognize patterns. It gets easier as you go on. So here's that same model from before. So just take one more look at it. We're going to go ahead and break down each of these elements. So the first one is an external entity. It's represented by this box here. These are standard symbols for threat modeling. These are used across the board. You'll see these everywhere. They're pretty universal. External entities are reflected by a rectangle. They are representing things that are outside of an application's control. They are things like users, things like third-party services, things that are not assigned threats because there's nothing that you can do to mitigate their threat generally. You can't change what a user does to your application. You can't change what a third-party application sends into your application. That's also why if you choose to map beyond a external entity, you won't be applying threats to that either. And generally that will be considered out of scope because whatever is happening on the other side of the external entity is by definition out of our control. So like it says here, if you can't control it, you can't protect it. The next element is the processes. You have a process with a single circle and multi-process with a double circle. They can represent either an entire application, if that's what the scope of the model calls for, or just a small section of a code, a small feature. You have to talk about so just when you decide between a process and a multi-process, you're talking about security context. So a multi-process is generally used when a process does more than one thing in terms of an application. However, if by breaking that process out into if you break that multi-process out into multiple single processes, if that doesn't add any additional security context, you don't necessarily need to mark it as a multi-process, right? But if that's easier for you to understand, that's fine too. You have to learn that threat modeling is very subjective. Threat modeling is not as these elements that are universally used, but there are very few hard and fast rules about what you need to do in a specific scenario. It's a very internal and personal tool, so what works for your team, what works for your project is what's best. As long as everyone in the room understands what's happening, that's what's important really. And also, processes are generally the most vulnerable of all the elements just because of the complexity involved. Data stores are represented by these two parallel lines. They can be databases, file systems, system registries, pretty much anywhere that data comes to rest. It's just something that you have to, it shows the context of the data. You have to learn that data at rest is easier to capture because it's there, so you have to tailor your protections around that. Next element is data flows. These are represented just by arrows. Make sure you draw the arrowheads on the arrows to represent which direction the data is flowing. And always make sure you label the data flows. That's something a lot of people forget. They just draw arrows all over the place, and you're not exactly sure later what data is flowing where. It's also important to make sure that each piece of data gets its own data flow. So you, for instance, when you're drawing a diagram, you can't draw just one data flow between two things and write, username / cart / unless that's all being sent at once. If they're being sent separately, they should have their own data flows. And the protection consideration there is that data in transit is generally easy to see if it's unprotected. So that's where you aim your mitigations. Next element is the trust boundary, represented by the red dotted line. In the Microsoft threat modeling tool and a lot of other tools, they don't use a line, they use a box to draw trust, but it's the same concept, red dotted. You draw data flows through these lines, basically to show that what's inside the box or inside the curve is what you're trusting, what your application is trusting, and everything outside is not trusted. So you can use that to visualize that data coming in from outside of a trust boundary needs to be verified, and data going out doesn't need to be verified because it's under control. Generally, of course, there's exceptions to rules like this. So when you actually get into modeling, there are several levels of complexity that can happen. This is the smallest level of complexity. This is what we call a context diagram. It's just a high level. You can use it just to get a general idea of your application if you are early in the stages of speccing it out, or if you're doing something like presenting this to an executive who doesn't need to know all the nuts and bolts of the application. Coming up to this high level will help you in that area. You make sure you get the most significant areas of the application and you label everything just like you normally would, but maybe you leave some of the more technical pieces out. When you bring those in is when you jump into the further levels of application modeling. So level 1, level 2, and level 3 are just more and more detailed models. As you can see here, this is the same model as the previous slide. These are the same models. This is just a level 1 diagram of this context diagram. So what you can see here is that this multi-process has now been broken out into 2 singular processes, represented by the circles. And additional databases have been added, and this credit card processor has been added to show additional levels of detail. Now, these things still existed in the previous, but they were either out of scope for the purpose of the diagram, or they just were too technical to be included in whatever the purpose of the context diagram was. Usually you'll see multiprocesses broken down in these levels. That's usually when you can, it's difficult to know when you're done breaking down a threat model. When you have no more multiprocesses, when you've broken them all down as far as they can go into singular processes, that's generally a good place to stop and consider maybe we've broken it down enough and we can move on to the next steps. So here's some tips that people run into commonly. So here we have a process that is just sharing data with a data store and it's coming back and forth, which is fine, but the problem is that this data doesn't seem to come from anywhere. Unless it's originating from the data store, and this is a highly scoped environment, you have to make sure that you are pointing to an area where your data is coming from. Your data originates from a user. Your data originates from another process. Your data originates from somewhere. So always make sure you're pulling your data from its original source. Usually will be an external entity. Next is magical data flow. So here we have 2 data stores exchanging data with each other, which again can happen. However, this isn't enough detail. What's actually happening is there's a process that's regulating the data that's being transferred between these 2 data stores. So you have to make sure to include this process in your diagram because the process is telling the data stores where to send the data, when to send the data, what data to send, and how to pull it. So these are very important things when you come to modeling threats. You need to make sure you have the process involved. That's weird. Okay, so the last tip that I have is to make sure that you're modeling your data's uses to the fullest extent. Here we have a process that sends data to a data store, but nothing really happens with it afterwards. So you always have to be making sure that you're keeping up with this and asking yourself things like, is any other process pulling this data later? Are there analytics involved? Is there another process that's going to kick off when this happens? Make sure you're continuing along and make sure that the information that's happening after the storage is still within scope of your project. Okay. So we're going to move into threats. Put your hand up if you've heard of the STRIDE system for threats. Okay, good. We're going to go over these quickly. You don't have to use these. This is what's recommended by Microsoft to use to assign threats to threat models generally, but also anywhere. They, again, are not hard and fast categories. Sometimes vulnerabilities will be part of multiple STRIDE categories. That's no problem. And you shouldn't get bogged down on assigning a particular vulnerability a STRIDE category because, again, it's for your understanding. It's for your ease of reference. It's not, you're not trying to win a contest to make sure everything's in the right category, right? So, spoofing. This is most commonly done through, well, not so much anymore, but back in the day it was more through email and phone, right? People pretend to be someone else. They change email headers. They spoof sources. They do all kinds of things basically to carry out any sort of action that they can without using their own identity, whether that's pretending to be a machine, to pretending to be another server, pretending to be another person, to pretending to be a highly privileged user. Excuse me. Spoofing is about doing things not under your own identity. It gets tough because it can bring other effects into play depending on how powerful the spoofed entity becomes or is. The spoofed entity may already be a powerful user, let's say, an administrative user. All the rights that come along with that might be granted if you can properly spoof a user like that. The T in STRIDE is tampering. The important thing here is to talk about that this is when changes happen that would otherwise not be allowed if it were not for this vulnerability. This means that in normal functioning of this program, a user would not be able to change the data with the permissions that they're given. This can lead to data loss and data integrity issues. If people have access to data they shouldn't have access to, then they can remove it, they can change it, or they can at least release the information. This is most commonly depicted with network traffic, because network traffic can be sniffed. If you are on the same network, it's relatively easy with several tools. Fiddler, Burp, any sort of proxy, Wireshark, that kind of thing will let you see this traffic come across if it's not protected. The R in STRIDE stands for repudiation. This is a weird word that a lot of people give Microsoft flack for just wanting to spell the word stride. To repudiate something means to deny, to say that you were not responsible for it. So it gets a little confusing because then you go to non-repudiation, which means that you did carry something out. So try not to get confused there. Repudiation means that you're able to deny your responsibility to an action. And the most common way to fix this is logs. Make sure all of your items have history on them. You carry out transaction logs. You have diagnostics tools. You have an event viewer built in on your operating system. Any tool that you can use, go ahead and fire it up and make sure that you are using it to collect as much data as you can or is reasonable within your context. We need it for all kinds of things. Who can give me a couple reasons why you would want logging data post-mortem? Audits, yeah. You get a compliance audit in, they want to know who's been touching what and how they have access to it, sure. What else?
To figure out how an attacker got in.
Sure. Absolutely, evidence collection, forensics, that kind of thing, sure. What else? A little less, yeah. Yeah, troubleshooting, right? You want all kinds of information available to you if something goes wrong, or if you need to update something, you need this information available. It's great. The I is information disclosure. Similar to tampering, except information isn't being changed. It's just being viewed by, again, someone who normally would not be able to see it were it not for this vulnerability. This can be extremely dangerous under the right circumstances. It seems a little innocuous at first, but when you work into the cases of it, it can get pretty dangerous. Errors especially can reveal a ton of information. To the average person, it can spit out usernames and passwords just unwittingly, but also to an experienced attacker, even lines of code are gold pieces of information for getting them further along their exploit path, it basically gives them a look behind the curtain of how your application works. The more an attacker knows about your application, especially an experienced attacker, the better they can exploit, and the better they can get further on and get more information and do worse acts to your application. D is denial of service. So you guys probably most likely hear denial of service used in the network context most often. You're talking about someone or some program or botnets sending thousands, millions of large packets to a single web server, so many that the web server can't handle legitimate requests and for all intents and purposes is brought down, or actually does crash. That's not what we're talking about here. That is much more of a network level attack. We're talking about the application level. So here we're talking about applications using accidentally, or a user being able to force an application to use too much memory, to use too much CPU, to use to bring the disk up to 100%, because anything that they can do to bring those resources up, then again we're denying legitimate users access to the service. Scope is important when considering a vulnerability. So there are lots of instances wherein you can deny service to yourself. But this isn't necessarily a vulnerability. So for instance, if you want to upload a large document to a service, the server might choke on that a little bit, but most likely it'll be local to you. You won't be able to use that service anymore. Technically, you could say that's a denial of service. However, if you were able to upload a document that large and there was an issue that caused high resource usage when that document was retrieved, and other users are pulling that document up, now you're causing other users who are not involved in the initial attack to have their service denied to them. That's when we're concerned about it being an actual vulnerability. Okay, the last one in the STRIDE is the E, elevation of privilege. Something I like to say here is that when you put your application out, when you give your administrators privileges and rights for them to assign to their users, you're making a promise to them. You're saying, here, you can manage this application, go ahead and assign these rights and privileges as you see fit, and then your application will be protected in that way. But if these privileges are broken or they aren't checked in the proper manner, then you're breaking your promise to them. You are effectively taking security out of their hands. These controls don't mean anything if they don't work, if they can be circumvented. A big thing I see in new functionalities that come out in mature software is growing privilege checks. So these new features don't always go back and respect every previous privilege that might not have been around even when that developer was there. Or they don't have a privilege assigned to themselves. The privileges aren't granular enough. The administrator doesn't have the ability to turn off this privilege to a user. So when you're designing an application, think about, does every user need access to the feature that you're adding? If not, consider giving the administrator the ability to turn that off. And of course, elevation of privilege is the most dangerous stride effect, because with proper elevation of privilege, you can gain total control of the application. You'll be able to easily spoof other users. You'll be able to tamper with data you wouldn't normally have access to. You'll be able to read data you wouldn't normally have access to. You'll be able to repudiate any claim because you can probably log in as a super user or push your rights into an area where it would be hard to prove that it was you, given that your user shouldn't have those rights. So it's particularly dangerous. So what do we do when we come across these vulnerabilities in our software? Well, first we can redesign the software, right? And that's great. It avoids the vulnerability altogether. We redesign to completely reroute around that vulnerability so it's not even a problem anymore. This works well for some brand new features that have not yet been implemented. And generally, you don't need any specialized security knowledge to do something like this. You just need to know the application you developed and rework it. Problems with this is that you are effectively starting over in a lot of cases. It's also not always possible. For instance, if you have an issue wherein traffic can be sniffed while it's being sent from one place to another, the only way to redesign around that is don't send the data. Well, maybe for the functionality of your product, you need to send that data, so this is just not feasible. And of course, redesigns always come with backward compatibility issues. So if you can't redesign, what do? You can use a standard remediation. Again, going back to our sniffing problem, this is something like we're going to go ahead and require TLS on this data channel so that all the traffic is encrypted. Even if someone reads it, they won't be able to understand what's happening. They won't be able to affect it in a meaningful way. And these have a lot of pros. They're widely tested and documented. It's the best alternative to redesign. There's often frameworks available for things like this, so you don't necessarily have to understand exactly how the underlying technology works. As long as you can get the frameworks into your software, you'll be off to a great start. And they're trusted by your customers. Problems are that some of these frameworks are broken. Some of these remediations themselves are broken. SSL v3 recently joined that list of technologies that are just fallen by the wayside. These things need maintenance. For instance, again, a few years ago, SSL v3, or maybe 10 years ago, SSL v3 might not have seemed like a bad idea to go ahead and use. But you need to keep up with these new technologies as things break. You need to go back and make sure that these things happen. They do require a little bit of specialized security knowledge because they have to be implemented flawlessly. This is especially true with cryptography. You can't just flip a switch and say things are encrypted now. There's all kinds of implementation tricks that have to go along with that. Okay, if for some reason you can't use a standard remediation, then you have to resort to a custom remediation. The best thing about this is guaranteed to fit your application. You're writing it, so great. It'll work in your application, no problem. Problem is, it's probably broken. The standard remediations that exist today have gone through such a beating to maintain their status, and they fall all the time. Again, I referenced SSL v3. That was around for so long before just one vulnerability brought it down. So the remediation that you can develop at your desk in an hour probably won't stand up to the same muster that those things will. They need a lot of maintenance, and probably you'll have to do the maintenance because this is not an easy thing to do because it requires security guruship. This is next level stuff. This is people who have, doctorates in finite math. This is what they do, right? This is not for your average developer. Again, it's heavily dependent on the creator. The odds that somebody else will be able to come in and maintain the code that you create on this level is very low. It'll most likely just end up being ripped out. Not only that, but your QA people or whoever is in charge of your testing won't have a reliable way to test it like they do with the standard remediations. With the standard remediations, they know the processes and the practices that's supposed to follow. They can ensure that's what's happening. With your custom remediation, they generally have to take your word for how it's supposed to happen. So the only way it'll get thorough testing, because again, just like the developers, QA people have a limited amount of time on their hands, it'll only be really thoroughly tested by the bad guys. And they're not trusted by your customers. If your customers are asking you what kind of protections you have in place, telling them that you have it covered, don't worry, I figured it out, I got it all protected on my desk, so they're not gonna like that too much. So if you don't want to do a custom remediation, or you can't, the last mitigation is risk acceptance. Pro number 1, no work, right? Woo, we're done. Send it to the documentation team, tell them, hey, so this is broken, try not to tell too many people. It doesn't delay your software from getting out the door. We all know that's a big problem in a software house. You have deadlines you have to meet, and security takes time. However, the problem is definitely broken. You know it's broken. That's why we're doing this. That might become public knowledge, especially through the documentation or a researcher finding it on their own. Somebody's going to find out, and the wrong people might learn about this vulnerability. When that comes to light, it can damage your reputation, talk about how it could take away from the quality of your software, and that'll make your customers angry. And if the information gets out wide enough, it'll prevent you from winning new deals, from selling your software to new people. All right, we'll move on to some final tips here. Okay, so after your threat model is complete, walk through some validation steps. Make sure that your threat models are consistent with the latest design. This means after your design, implementation, and verification step, go back and take a look at your threat model and make sure that what you intended to develop is actually what you developed. I'm sure everyone in this room has seen something that doesn't look anything like the spec that the software started out with. And that's fine, but we have to make sure that we keep the documentation up to date. When you do a threat model, you lay out a lot of assumptions. We assume that this server is under our control. We assume that this user will only do this. You have to go back and document those assumptions and verify that they're actually true. Make sure that you have accounted for all security relevant details. So basically just go back over the threat model one more time, see if there's any additional areas of vulnerability that you found. And review your mitigations to make sure that they're actually working as intended. So, tips. Before you have a threat modeling meeting, actually go ahead and draft yourself a data flow diagram. Meetings go a lot quicker if everyone comes into the room with a diagram already in their head at least, or on paper ideally. If everyone comes into the room at once and is like, okay, so that's how the 4.5-hour meetings start. Right? So if you come to the meetings prepared, everything goes a lot quicker. You can compare ideas. A lot more gets done a lot quicker. Involve as many team members as possible, not at once, but get some diversity in the room, get people that aren't as experienced so they can learn and get these things up. Even if all they're doing is observing the first few times, they're at least able to learn, and maybe they'll have some input on something you didn't think about. Make sure you're making distinct data flows for each type of data. This happens a lot. Make sure, even if they're going the same direction, make sure you're drawing several arrows in that same direction if there are different types of data being sent at different times. And always be mindful of the security context. So you can always do this on paper or on a whiteboard if you want, but there's also this threat modeling tool from Microsoft. I was going to put a link up here, but you guys know how bad Microsoft's links are, so go ahead and just Google for Microsoft Threat Modeling Tool 2014. It'll come up, download here, it's free. It has all the elements, you just drag them over, you can resize them, label them, document your assumptions, put the threat boxes around it, everything. It's good for verifying your paper threat models and archiving them, and verifying all your assumptions. So that's all I had. Do you guys have any questions before we move on to the activity? No? Okay, so I'm going to split you guys up into 3 groups here. So you 2 guys and everyone there is a group. You 6 guys here are a group, and you know what, all you guys here, and then all you guys over there are a group also. And I'm going to hand out these scenarios, and what we're going to do is you are going to draft a threat model. You don't have to put threats on it, just go ahead and draw the diagram out, and then when you are finished, go ahead and bring it up and draw it on the whiteboard, and we're going to talk about it. Okay? So you guys... For those of you that have been here before, you know that we like to give our speakers a little gift for coming out. That's what this has been up here all night. It's our little message in a bottle from our very own InfoSec Sage. If you don't know about the InfoSec Sage, he's very affiliated with CleveSec. Go ahead and check him out on Twitter at InfoSec Sage. Got a little message in the bottle for you there, and this is actually a 8 gig flash drive also for you.
Oh, cool.
That's for you.
That's awesome. Thank you.
One more round of applause for Rox. All right, so some upcoming events. Maybe. There we go. B-Sides Columbus is happening on the 19th. That is next Monday. All day. I think there are tickets still available. I'm not positive, though. We did tweet the link out where to get tickets. So go ahead and check that. We'll tweet it out again in the next few days. They've been pretty bad about actually giving that information out. So. And OWASP Cleveland is happening at 11 a.m. on the 28th. I believe that is a Thursday. I can't remember exactly. But that is happening at Secure State in Bedford Heights, I think there. We'll also be sending more information out about that. You'll have to register for that. But again, no big deal. So those are the biggest events coming up. We also, of course, have our community night last Tuesday of the month. It's going to be at Maestro's 3 spot this month. So come out and have some discussion and some drinks with us, and we'll see you there. Thank you guys so much for coming out. Thank you to Roxane for speaking, and we'll see you guys next time. Thank you.